Hello and welcome to module 3 of the course. In this video, we'll be discussing about AWS Lambda and DynamoDB. So let's start with AWS Lambda as of now. So AWS Lambda lets you run code without provisioning or managing servers. You pay only for the compute time you consume. So basically, AWS Lambda is the backbone of serverless computing. With Lambda, you can run code for virtually any type of application or backend service, all with zero administration. Just upload your code and Lambda takes care of everything required to run and scale your code with high availability. You can set up your code to automatically trigger from other AWS services or call it directly from any web or mobile application. Let's understand Lambda function usage using this example. So this is a S3 object index example in which when you upload an object to AWS S3, it will invoke the Lambda function and it will put an entry in the Amazon DynamoDB in the form of table so that to make a record what object has been uploaded. So this is kind of like event driven architecture in which you do something somewhere and that service will invoke the Lambda to do whatever is required from that action. So basically the S3 object was the event source. So in the last example, so you can see this current example in which any event source that can be from AWS or from outside as well, uh, that will invoke the Lambda function depending on some event that is generated, and it will call the external service to do whatever task is required depending on that event. So Lambda function is basically a service which holds some code, some function code. It can be in the form of Python or Node.js or any other language. So which helps in executing the response depending on the event that is generated. So usually it will when the function is called, it will do some function, it will do some activity and return the response to the event source. So if we talk about the event sources in Lambda, we have event sources like Amazon S3, DynamoDB API Gateway, Kinesis, Cognito, SNS, SES. So a lot of these sources can be considered as event sources. So just like in the previous example, we discussed that when something is put into S3, it will trigger the Lambda function. Similarly, if somebody has in DynamoDB, if somebody is creating a table or somebody is putting some entry, that can also create a Lambda, trigger the Lambda function because as we see here, AWS Amazon DynamoDB is mentioned as an event source. Similarly, like from if you talk about CloudWatch, so if some alert is generated in CloudWatch and it senses the alert, it can trigger the Lambda function to perform some activity. Suppose like you have like 10 servers and one of the server goes down due to some activity. So it can trigger the CloudWatch can trigger the Lambda function to create a new EC2 instance. Or suppose if some server is having high CPU utilization or high memory utilization, in that case also uh, the CloudWatch can trigger the Lambda function to perform some activity based on that. So similarly, these event sources can trigger the Lambda function and can perform tasks depending on that. So here are some examples of uses of Lambda. So in this example, uh, somebody has placed the order and it got the entry in the DynamoDB, and the DynamoDB triggers the Lambda function, and our Lambda function will invoke the Redshift service to provide analytics data to the from the data source. So this is one of the example where Lambda can be used to build a serverless application in which data validation can be performed using the insights of the data. And here is another example of a weather app where if user clicks on getting the information of the weather, it will trigger the Lambda function and create some entry and present the user with the current weather information. So in this, we have used Amazon API Gateway as well for exposing the URL of the web application, and we have used S3 and DynamoDB as well. So these kind of scenarios can be performed using AWS Lambda to build serverless applications. So I think that's pretty enough for introduction to Lambda.